Hey, what is up, everybody? It is Uncle Mad here tonight, live streaming the Tennessee Titans State of the Union, as it were. I was planning on doing like a 2022 season recap video a while back, actually, kind of right towards the end of the season, but then so much change was happening with the team. Obviously, we had already fired John Robinson. And then shortly after the season ended, we fired Todd Downing, a few other coaches. So I just decided I wanted to hold off until we had made the new hires, till we had set the team up, made the transition, so that we would have, not just a downer, depressing look back on what was overall a pretty crummy season in 2022, but we could also kind of look at the changes the team had made and kind of be able to have a picture at least of what might be happening to correct the issues, to improve the team, to move forward. And since we've now, hired the new general manager, Ran Carthon, since we, for better or worse, added the new coaches to the coaching staff, I think, up until we get through free agency and the draft, right now is kind of when we have the best idea of what the team is looking to do in terms of improving from the 2022 season and moving forward. Uh, but before we get to what's coming first, I did want to recap and kind of look back over 2022 just a little bit. Don't want to dwell on it because there's been enough said about the 2022 season by a lot of people smarter than me. I don't want to, pick at a scab, so to speak, but do want to talk about it. I mean, obviously, it went off a cliff very fast. The Titans were 7-2 to start the season. At one point in time, somewhat knocking on the door of potentially being in the mix for the number one overall seed, and then lose 7 straight to end the season. Just, it's kind of one of the few times that sometimes Titans fans will complain about, not getting enough attention from mainstream media. But, I think this season was one time where being a small market and not being in the spotlight really benefited us, because, I mean, this has to be an all-time collapse this season, to be 7-2, lose 7 straight, and miss the playoffs in kind of spectacular fashion. This, I mean, it has to be, I don't know about the statistics or the, official records, but it feels like to me it just has to be one of the like all-time biggest season collapses. And the fact that it just kind of happened and went out like a whimper and nobody really talked about it on the, bigger stages on the mainstream media is, it's a good thing for the Titans this season that we were kind of under the radar on that one. But in my mind, there's some, clear, very clear issues that can be pointed to as to what went wrong this season. Why did the season fall apart? Uh, 3 in particular that kind of really, I think, were the crux of things, and they kind of all work together, because if you have like one issue, you can usually overcome it. Like if you've got bad coaching but good players, the good players can often outplay the bad coaching. We've seen that in the past with the Titans. If you've got bad players but good coaches, good coaches can maybe overcome it and having a shortcomings in the roster. If you've got injuries but you've got good coaching and still good players, if you have a few things wrong, you can usually find your strengths can overcome those. But when everything went wrong this season the way it did, combined to just make it the catastrophe that it was. So right out of the gate, I mean, I think we can see now, looking back, the overall roster construction just wasn't what it needed to be in terms of trying to keep the team competitive, trying to keep the team not only a team that can make the playoffs, but, it was in a quote-unquote Super Bowl window. And obviously that's one of the reasons that John Robinson was fired, was that the roster build, and this has been a few years coming, I think, with some failed drafts and some other poor trades and free agencies in past seasons, just this year's roster just wasn't what it needed to be a competitive team. I mean, it's honestly a credit to at least some of the coaches that they got to be 7-2 with the roster they had in place, because, I mean, no real speed, no real deep threat on offense with A.J. Brown being traded away. Treylon Burks showed flashes, but, he's a rookie. He's not necessarily a burner. We didn't really have anybody that was really a burner at wide receiver. Tight ends, Cheek, rookie, showed signs of promise, but he was underutilized, and the players that were utilized weren't that great. Hooper came on in the second half of the season At tight end, Jeff Swaim is just a boil on the backside of the Tennessee Titans franchise. But obviously the biggest area, of concern, of problems was clearly the offensive line. I mean, you can point to Taylor Lewan tearing his ACL week 2 and being out for most of the season. You can point to Ben Jones missing several games with concussions. You can, say what you will, but I mean, ultimately, failed drafts and failed ability to develop players on the offensive line finally caught up to the season. Realistically, it's been a problem for a few years, and I think the fact that Derrick Henry has been such a stud kind of helped cover up that the offensive line overall just wasn't that good. First time I really caught it and where I really looked at it and said, man, our offensive line just isn't what it should be or isn't as good as you think it is, was the end of the 2020 season. We were in the playoffs against the Baltimore Ravens. That was the tail end of the COVID season where we weren't necessarily sitting in our normal seats at games because everybody was still spread out. They were doing social distancing still. So for that playoff game, I sat in the upper deck. I normally sit in the lower bowl. I'm not some deep dive analyst who watches the all 22 and stuff like that. I just watch the team, think my thoughts. I'm just a fan sharing his thoughts. But in that game, sitting in the upper deck, it was almost like getting to watch the all 22 because you could really see the full field. You could see the full pattern of the way the plays were developing. And throughout that entire game against the Ravens, we were running no more than 3 receivers out into routes, and most of the time it was 2. We were max protecting Jonnu Smith, who should have been a massive weapon for us and was at times, was almost completely used as a blocker throughout that game because the offensive line was so inefficient, particularly at pass protection. We needed the extra help to make sure Ryan Tannehill wasn't getting hit. And particularly, I can understand kind of why maybe that was bigger in that game because the Ravens back then, that was when Wink Martindale was still their defensive coordinator. And, Wink Martindale, he blitzes like 7 players every play. So had the extra protection there, weren't able to really run the full offense we'd seen from Arthur Smith over his 2 years at that point because of that. Once again, Taylor Lewan was out injured in that one. We had Dennis Kelly and maybe a Quesenberry as tackles. I don't even remember, but you could just see from the upper deck, seeing the plays we were running, that we were not comfortable leaving Tannehill exposed. So it was a lot of max protect. And if you only have 2 receivers running routes, that's incredibly easy for defenders to defend, and particularly when those receivers were A.J. Brown, who was, not at his peak yet. Do we still have, what was the little short guy who could run some deep passes? Was pretty quick. I want to say Ratliff, but I know that's wrong. But he was number 14, I don't remember his name. But we didn't have anything close to once again, story of the Titans, their entire franchise history, didn't have any type of real talent in the receiver core. If you have 2 stud receivers and that's all the routes you're running, maybe you can get away with it. But when it's A.J. Brown who was on the come up and then just hodgepodge of whoever else we were throwing out there, that it just wasn't working. And also, I think that's, Tannehill gets bad, rap for that game and the Bengals game, but just didn't have options. And I think he was forcing things, trying to make things happen when he didn't really have options. But Khalif Raymond, it just came to me. Khalif Raymond, that's who it was. So that game, first game, I was like, holy crap, and that was Derrick Henry's 2,000-yard season. So that's, kind of covered up the holes that the offensive line had because you're like, oh man, we got a running back that ran for 2,000 yards. But then sitting in the upper deck, seeing how much the team felt like they couldn't just leave the offensive line on their own and had to give them extra help, it was like, oh, maybe Derrick Henry is just an absolute beast and specimen, and the offensive line is actually garbage. So that was that one. And that kind of leads me into sort of the second phase of what I think is the biggest problem with this team. And it's an obvious one. It was the one everybody with a brain was screaming from the rooftops all season long, and even going back into last season, is the offensive coordinator, Todd Downing. Now, he's got some good things. He's not a complete failure. You can see signs of why he was given the opportunity. He'd been there. Vrabel likes, obviously, as we've seen in this last week, he likes to promote from within. He trusts guys who are around him. And there's certain things that Todd Downing did, efficiently. Obviously, the run game kept going well. Red zone, we kept a lot of the efficiency that we had under Arthur Smith sort of continued on into Todd Downing. Usually, the first kind of drive script usually worked pretty good. In the NFL, they typically have the first 15 to 20 plays planned out and scripted. those usually went okay. It was when he got beyond that area where he really always fell apart. And to me, the biggest issue he had, and I've been saying it for 2 years, is that our offense doesn't have routes for the receivers that help the receivers. Everything we do is very basic, straightforward routes where you're kind of relying on the receiver to somehow make a move, make a shift, get themselves open. There's not, you see in the NFL now, there's so much extra help that's been given to receivers where there's little bump routes where two receivers cross and they sort of, knock a DB out of the way and, you got to make it look subtle where it's not pass interference on the offense. There's disguised routes where a guy sneaks out of the backfield, you fake a screen one way, come back with a screen the other way. There's just so many things that teams do to help receivers get open, to not just make it all on the receiver to find a way to get open. And we have just never done that. If you look at the last 2 years under Todd Downing, you can probably count on one hand how many times receivers were actually what you would really truly say was open. Once again, this is another one where, like, everybody gives Tannehill fault, but go back to that Bengals game, man. He had to throw the ball somewhere, and nobody was open all day long. He was having to throw into coverage. Like, should he throw into triple coverage? Obviously not, but I mean, go back and look at those plays and, find where the open receivers were that he could have been throwing to, and you won't find many examples of it. Even the big touchdown pass to A.J. Brown in that game, a defensive back draped all over him, and A.J. Brown was just such a stud that he managed to make that happen. So painful to talk about that still. But I mean, I was talking to a friend about it at one point during the season. The other thing where I clearly think there's just no creativity, no real schematic design to our routes, is that you also just never see like a fully busted coverage for the Titans. Like, how many times a season do you see against the Titans or just around the NFL just a wide receiver just 50 yards downfield wide open because the defense got mixed up and something happened and left him wide open? Never happens with the Titans. I think there was one time this season, NWI, I think against the Colts, maybe, was just left alone on the island way downfield, and I think we underthrew it and almost like messed the whole thing up to begin with. But it just doesn't happen with the Titans, and I think part of that is they say busted coverage in those situations, but a lot of the times it's not necessarily that the coverage was busted. It's that the play was designed in a way to suck a defender out of where they were supposed to be to open that space. It's designed to create that opening. It's not just a DB lost their mind and forgot where they were supposed to go. Something in the play design drew them away from their assignment. They looked and saw, oh, there's an extra runner underneath. I should probably step up even though I'm supposed to be the deep cover. Stuff like that. And I think that's why that never happens for the Titans, is the routes, the designs, the plays just weren't creative enough to do that little extra bit to help the receivers find open space. It was always easy, simple, basic routes, and then hope the receivers do something to create space for themselves. Which, if you've got like speedsters, burners, which we don't, like even A.J. Brown, is not really truly like a speedster turn on the afterburns type player. He's more of a physical size speed combination player. That maybe can work a little bit more, but when you've got receivers like Julio Jones, whose legs were gone, Robert Woods, which certainly looks like his legs are gone, they don't have any burst. They don't have that quick burst, that ability to separate. You're not helping yourselves in those situations. And to me, that was the biggest issue with Downing, was his inability to be more creative, particularly in the passing game. Now, the crazy thing about that is when it came to him trying to be creative, he just had there was no in between with him. Like, he went from zero, the most bland, basic plays, to if he tried something creative, it was the most insane, over the top, just like overcomplicated play possible. Like, we'd need a 3rd and 1, and he'd run like a double tight end reverse that would get stopped for like a 4-yard loss instead of just quarterback sneak. Which, look at the Eagles. They're in the Super Bowl because suddenly they remembered, hey, 4th and 1, 3rd and 1, it's not that complicated. Quarterback sneak at every play. We couldn't do that. We had to do like double tight end reverses. The best example of this is and it was always in situations where you don't need to be tricky and creative and complicated like that, like 4th and short, 3rd and short, whatever. Like the last game against the Jaguars, run some just bizarre play that had no chance of working, where it was like a bubble screen out to Treylon Burks, and I know he wasn't supposed to do what he actually ended up doing. It was supposed to be like a throwback pass, normal, but he gets hit as soon as he catches the ball and just chucks the ball backwards over his head. just you could even see it. There was just no scenario it was going to work because it was so much overcomplicated, but also so easy to read for Jacksonville at the same time, which is the Todd Downing in a nutshell. Somehow make a play super complicated, but also make it super easy for the defense to defend. Is this and the personnel wasn't good enough. He wasn't good enough. So you put those two things together. It's like I said, if you've got good coaching, you can overcome bad personnel. If you've got bad personnel but good coaching, you can overcome the bad personnel. If you've got good personnel but bad coaching, you can overcome the bad coaching. But we had bad coaching and bad personnel. And then we threw in the big third tier of what made the 2022 season fall apart so badly. Second year in a row, just decimated with injuries. And this year, I think the big difference between last year and this year when it came to the injuries is the overall depth wasn't good enough, and the injuries were to more significant players this season. So last season, we plugged in people when there was injuries. We were able to kind of survive, kind of move forward. This year, I mean, the drop off from, people have, Taylor Lewan's a polarizing player. I think he's been pretty solid throughout his career for the most part. My mom hates him. She thinks he's one of the worst Titans of all time. But the drop off from whatever he is capable of doing to what Dennis Daly did is, I've never seen anything so severe. I can't fathom how Dennis Daly basically started every game this season for the Tennessee Titans. Like how there was never a time he got benched. There was never a chance to try anything else. There was never any corrections to his issues. Never any, fixes there. And that goes back to coaching too, because I was saying early on this season, I think the offensive line coach needs to go too, because we were spoiled for years when we had Mike Munchak as our offensive line coach, and we basically didn't even have to draft offensive linemen. We just get guys off the street, and Mike Munchak would turn them into all pros every freaking year. And it was crazy because you see them leave. I remember like the big one was like Nick Hardwick, the center we had, who was like either an undrafted free agent or like a seventh round pick, and he was like a stud for us. He was awesome. He was like Pro Bowls and everything, and then he left and got a big contract in San Diego, and I think he lasted like maybe a year or two more after that, because once he got outside of the Munchak coaching shell of protection, he wasn't anywhere close to what he was before. That's just one example. Mike Munchak did that all the time when he was our offensive line coach, and I think you just look across the board, and there's just been, especially when you look at the young offensive linemen we've drafted, you can half blame John Robinson for drafting players that maybe weren't good enough, but also at some point in time, the coach has to get more out of the players than what our coach got out of the offensive lineman. Aaron Brewer, undersized, probably should never have been an NFL offensive lineman. I don't really know how he got to that point, but he was there, but he sucked. He was decent enough in run blocking, but just pass blocking, he just get trucked every single play. Nicholas Petit-Frere started the season pretty good, but then majorly went off a cliff towards the second half of the season. Technique issues that just never seemed to be getting fixed on him. Just there was like this one simple, quick inside move. Just every defensive lineman who saw any tape knew they could do it, and somehow that never got corrected. That never got addressed. That never got adjusted. Obviously, two big flops in drafts so far. Isaiah Wilson, the big notable one, but I mean, I don't know that you can really blame any coach for that. That was just destined for disaster, and who knows what's gonna happen there. But with Dylan Radins, he was clearly going to be a project player. Like he had played D2 or D3 college, and it hadn't played in over like a year because of a combination of like injuries, and I think some of the COVID stuff had also kept him out. Maybe like his team didn't play as much as others. I remember there was like a long gap between when he played his last college game and when he got into the NFL. And so it was like a known thing. It's known he's a project, but he's got a lot of raw talent. We thought enough of him to draft him in the second round, and he's not good enough to replace Dennis Daly. And that has to fall on the coach, in my mind, because you knew he was raw talent, you knew there was something there, and you just have not been able to get anything out of him. So, offensive line coach Kevin Strong, Todd Downing, defensive back coach Anthony Midget are three, probably weakest coaches, which is funny because like when Anthony Midget got fired, I like called my dad and I was kind of surprised by that. I thought, with the injuries and kind of shuffling the personnel, I thought the secondary was pretty good. And I actually looked at the stats, and we actually had the worst pass defense in the NFL last year that I just didn't know about. I guess I was just so used to now everybody in the NFL just throws for like 500 yards every single game. It just didn't seem like it was that big of a season of passing all over us, but it turns out it was. So three coaches that deserve to get fired, and certainly the question was going to be, would they get fired? The answer was yes. That kind of got me sidetracked talking about the coaches again. But yeah, injuries. I mean, like we last year fielded the most players in NFL history, something like 80, almost 90 players, and then we borderline almost broke that this season. I don't know what the final number of this season was, but I know we were back into the 80s again this year. And the injuries were more significant last year. A lot of the injuries were like to players, and we lucked out in some situations where we had good depth behind them. But we had David Long and Zach Cunningham out for long stretches of the season. Obviously Tannehill with his ankle issues. They tried to come back. He tried to play through, but ultimately he ended up missing 4 games, maybe 5, including like the last 2 or 3. Lawan being out for basically the whole season. Harold Landry tearing his ACL before the season even started. Jeff Simmons, he played through his injury for the most part, but you could just tell once he got injured, he was just not the same player. He didn't have the explosion to just blow up the offensive line like he did throughout the early part of the season. Denico Autry missed a few games. Really, when Denico Autry went out, that was kind of when things really took a turn. That was kind of the start of the bad stretch for us, and we never really recovered. Ben Jones missed a handful of games this season. Traylon Burks missed a ton. One, and I've been thinking about this, that was sneaky, maybe like the most significant injury, and we didn't realize how significant it was because we just haven't really seen that much of this player yet, was rookie wide receiver Kyle Phillips. So Kyle Phillips comes in. He's supposed to be the slot receiver, kind of the guy that's finds the weak spots in the zone and just sits in and catches short passes. Sometimes sneaks out and gets a longer pass, but really like that kind of slot receiver who just kind of finds the open space and helps you keep the chains moving. Like the kind we've never really had. We've tried for a while to get that guy and haven't been able to do it. And I think he was finally like potentially gonna be that guy. First game against the Giants, he was our lead receiver. Really went off, had a really, really good game, did some decent things in special teams. Was hurt. I can't remember if he missed the very next game, or I think he did miss the next game, the Bills game. Came back for the Raiders game. Didn't look right in the Raiders game. Looked like he was still hurt. Like he dropped a punt, got a concussion, got re-injured again, and I think it was a concussion at that point. But then or maybe aggravated the shoulder. I don't even remember. But then he just never came back after that Raiders game. We never saw him again. And you go back to that week 1 and what an impact he made in week 1. And you kind of think you throw him into the mix with Robert Woods and Traylon Burks and him giving us a different dimension than what those two were giving us, than what NWI and whoever else was just trotting out there. Kind of makes you think he could have been a big time player that could have really made a huge difference for us. But we don't really know because we only got really 1 game out of him before his season just got completely derailed by injuries. But it is what it is. I mean, you just can't survive that much, and I don't know what's being done or what the issue is. Obviously, one announcement that's come in the postseason is that Nissan Stadium is switching to matrix-style turf field, which is supposed to be really good. Like, the statistics on it show that it's actually a little bit better than grass when it comes to injuries. We don't know, but I can't imagine you have as much injury problems as we did just because of the grass at Nissan Stadium, which we've known for 30 years of going to that stadium. After, September, that grass is going to turn to crap and just be terrible. So it's not a surprise. I kind of just think more than anything, I like all the numbers, everything they've said about adding the turf to Nissan Stadium. Looks good, makes sense, but I also kind of think they know they're going to turf when they move to the new stadium in 2026. So somebody probably said, why are we going to, spend all the, landscaping, maintenance, greens, fees, whatever you want to call them, on grass for, 3 more years when we know we're going to turf eventually anyway. Let's just go ahead and make the switch now and save a few dimes on, the grounds crew or whatever. So that's been said. That's one thing they're trying to do to improve the injury situation, is get them off the terrible grass that Nissan Stadium has long had. Everybody jumps to say, the training staff changes there, but I don't even know that that's it, because you have so many injuries, like, Lawan's torn ACL, the ankle sprains for Tannehill. Those aren't, that's not anything your training staff can do. Like, the one thing you might blame your training staff for on those is, like, are they working on the right strength things to strengthen those type of muscles and stuff like that? I don't even know if there's anything you can really do for that to prevent those type of contact injuries. It's more the injuries were like, who was it? It was David Long and some other player who had the soft tissue, like muscle pulls constantly. That Variable called those two players out by name. David Long and one other that I can't remember, where he said they're repeat offenders when it comes to soft tissue injuries and they need to figure that out. So That's one where you've had those soft tissue injuries. Maybe you can look at the training staff and say something should be done differently there. But to have the amount of injuries that the Titans have had the last 2 seasons, it can't just be bad luck. There has to be something more to it. Is it the profile of the players we've signed and drafted? Are they just, injury prone for whatever reason? Is it, are we overworking them in practice during the week and then they're, sore and already kind of half banged up? Are we getting guys who are hurt and trying to get them to play through stuff and then they get hurt worse? Something weird's going on. Something's caused that. But ultimately, when you had the bad roster to begin with, when you lose, basically your entire roster over the course of the season, have to play over 80 players during the season, and when you got bad coaches who can't get, who can't maximize what talent they do have access to, that's the three of those, you just can't overcome that, and they weren't able to do it. So that's why the season ended up the way it did. And crazy, like I said, I think a lot of people maybe are getting a little sour on Vrabel because of this season and because of some of his more stubborn tendencies, but to have faced all the adversity the team faced and still be a potentially incorrect fumble call away from making the playoffs is pretty impressive. I mean, you can say what you want about the talent of the players that we had. The team came out to play just about every week. I think the only week where it really felt like they just did not show up was week 2 against the Bills. Like, I think every other week they went out and put out a pretty good fight. Sometimes they just wasn't their day and they didn't, weren't able to overcome the adversity they had. But they, till the end of the season, were fighting and trying and were in almost every game throughout the season. I mean, at one point in time, it seems so long ago, we were one play away from beating the Bengals. We were one play away from beating the Chiefs. And just, to go from that to where we were at the end of the season, it's just crazy. That's how long the NFL season is now, that those things happened in the course of the same season. But I talked longer than I wanted to about 2022. I was trying to keep it short because I just didn't want to dwell on that forever. But I'm going to put a bow on that. That's the 2022 season. It's behind us. We're moving forward. And now we're going to look ahead to what's happened in the offseason so far and what it could lead to for the team looking into the 2023 season. Obviously, the first big domino to fall was John Robinson got fired during the season, right after that Eagles game when his trade buddy, A.J. Brown, completely embarrassed the team. Pretty much if I said, oh, that had nothing to do with the timing of it, that had nothing to do with the timing of it. When people say there's nothing to do with the timing of it and that the timing is that spot on, I feel like it's something. I feel like, maybe Amy had already made the decision. Maybe she'd already decided that she was going to move on from John Robinson. And then that game was just kind of the final nail in the coffin where she was like, yep, definitely going to do it now because this guy that, I can assume she didn't want traded away, got traded away and then came back to just destroy us. But beyond like the roster build, beyond, the A.J. Brown trade, and listening to the way Amy Adams, Strunk, and Mike Vrabel talked about the process for selecting a new general manager, after the season ended and throughout the process, and even once Ran Carthon was introduced as the new general manager, the word that kept coming up over and over and over and over and over again was collaboration. And for them to have talked that much about looking for a general manager who was willing to collaborate, willing to be a part of the team, willing to, engage and collaborate, makes me think, and I don't know exactly when it would have happened because it always seemed like, John Robinson and Vrabel were on the same page. It all, Amy, she just gave, John Robinson a contract extension last February, a year ago from now. He got a contract extension and he didn't make it a year from then before he got fired. So somewhere along the way, I just have to think something about his process changed to where he was not taking outside ideas, taking information, where it had to have been almost like it become a his way or the highway type thing. I don't know if it was like siege mentality where so much had gone wrong for him over the course of a year that he just felt he had to dig himself out of it. He wasn't going to listen to anybody else or what. But for them to have just said over and over and over again with the general manager, we want to bring in somebody that's a team player that's going to collaborate, that's going to be on the board, had to be some stuff that was going down where Vrabel had ideas, Vrabel had suggestions, Vrabel had players he wanted, things he wanted, and J-Rob wasn't listening, or even Amy Adams herself, maybe was suggesting things that weren't getting listened to. We've seen that happen before. That's kind of what brought to the end the kind of initial golden era of Titans football, the Floyd Reese, Jeff Fisher era, was when Fisher and Reese could no longer get along, could no longer agree on roster and personnel decisions, and Fisher won that battle, and it certainly seems that Vrabel won the battle with John Robinson. And they can deny all they want, but when you talk that much about how you're looking for a partner, somebody to collaborate, it makes it very obvious that the person before was not doing that. Now, another one thing that's come up a lot more since they announced Ran Carthon from the San Francisco 49ers was going to be the team's new general manager. That collaboration word just kept going up. If you watched his introductory press conference and did a shot every time somebody at that press conference said collaboration, you would have been falling out of your seat by the end of it. But the other word that started coming up in there and that's been coming up more has been analytics. And this is something, I don't know the inner workings of the team, but I know there's members of the local media that have been critical of the Titans for having not embraced analytics as much as other franchises. Like, there's franchises that have, full staffs of an analytics department. And from my understanding, the Titans had maybe one person, and that person was known to not be listened to very much. Was it John Robinson who wasn't listening to him? Was it Vrabel who wasn't listening to him? That I don't know, but there's been a lot of reports about the lack of analytics being utilized within the Titans organization over the last few years. And I'm not like, one of these new people who's just like all about analytics. I think it's important. I mean, obviously, if you can use data to find trends, to find patterns that you can take advantage of, that's obviously something that's very useful. And if you can use the data to find issues that you're having to correct those issues, that's useful. I don't like some of these coaches, like I think it's the Chargers coach who's like, it seems like he makes every decision by like a chat GPT AI robot, runs the analytics for him. It's like, you should go for it on this 4th and 3 from the 37, and then he goes for it, loses the game. I think if we are going to be mixing more analytics, I kind of like the way I would assume it's going to go, because Vrabel seems like a kind of old school guy who's going to go by his gut, go by his instincts in certain situations, but I also see him not being opposed to utilizing analytics more when necessary, because we had 2 coaches who were shifted from position coaches to analyst, and I don't know that we've ever had a coach with the title analyst there, and that might not have anything to do with analytics, to be honest, but it just is interesting because I think we also, the assistant general manager that we hired from the Green Bay Packers, listed in his duties was specifically looking at analytics and studying analytics, and that's not been something that's been a part of anybody's job description at the Titans, to my knowledge, before. Like I said, I think the reports were that they only had one person who even worked on any type of analytics before. Ran Carthon told a great story in his opening press conference about how they used analytics at San Francisco to help identify Elijah Mitchell as a key player that they needed to draft. A situation where, like, they were going to draft a linebacker. They promised their defensive coordinator they were going to draft a linebacker, but they saw this guy, the numbers, they looked at the numbers on Elijah Mitchell. They just thought they were too good to pass up based on the numbers, and they trusted the numbers and went with it there. And Elijah Mitchell has worked out pretty good for them out there in San Francisco. So it definitely seems like that's going to be something we're going to see more of under this kind of new regime, is utilizing analytics, but also collaboration. Some people seem to think the collaboration thing means Mike Vrabel's in charge of everything now, and that Ran Carthon's been brought in to be like his just, puppet GM. But I didn't get the vibe from Ran Carthon that he's a dude who's just going to come in and be a pushover and just do whatever Mike tells him to do. He seemed like a very, strong alpha type personality where, obviously they were able to connect and decide that they'd be able to work together. But I don't see it being a situation where Mike Vrabel just goes, you do this, you do this, you do this, and Ran Carthon just follows all the instructions. I think, he'll have his own opinions, he'll have his own thoughts, and hopefully it can be what they say they want to do. It can be a collaboration where they work together to make the best possible decisions for the team. I'm excited about him. I'm very enthusiastic about him. I've liked everything I've seen from him so far. Very positive about that hire. We'll see where it goes. We haven't really gotten into any of the stuff to really be able to tell if he's, actually good at the job. We've only seen words up to this point, but, the draft is 2 months away. Free agency is about a month or so away. So we're going to start to see exactly what his strategy is, exactly what he's doing for this team, sooner rather than later. So I'm looking forward to that part of it. The other major thing that's happened since the season ended was obviously a lot of turnover in the coaching staff. As I mentioned, Todd Downing, offensive coordinator, was fired. Kevin Strong, offensive line coach, was fired. Anthony Midget, defensive back coaches, were fired. And this past week, we got the announcements of who was coming in to replace those three. And there was a lot of just like shuffling around. Like they took position coaches and moved them to coaching different positions. Our tight ends coach Luke Steckel got moved to I think passing game analyst. I mentioned that earlier a little bit. But we hired. This is where people kind of lost their minds a little bit because a lot of the hires we made were from within. For the offensive line coach, we promoted Kevin Strong's assistant offensive line coach, whose name I can't pronounce, to be the full offensive line coach now. Tim Kelly, brother of former Titans offensive lineman Dennis Kelly, got promoted from pass game coordinator to full-on offensive coordinator. Brought in Drake London from the Falcons to be quarterback coach and pass game coordinator. It's interesting because this is the second year in a row where we've hired somebody to be pass game coordinator that I think a large amount of people would have preferred that person get hired to be offensive coordinator. Because that's exactly what happened with Tim Kelly last year. Last year, everybody was saying, get rid of Downing. Tim Kelly is the man. Go get Tim Kelly. He's the best possible fit for this team. We need him to be our offensive coordinator. Fire Todd Downing. Go get Tim Kelly. Well, they didn't fire Todd Downing, but they did go get Tim Kelly. But they made him passing game coordinator, which don't really know what that means. Don't really know exactly what his role was, exactly what his involvement was in. Vrabel said something this past week about some of his primary responsibilities were scheming up first and second down passes, which we never pass on first down, so I don't know what that was. And as I mentioned before, our route design and pass play design wasn't too great in my opinion. So if Tim Kelly had any hand in that, that's a little bit of a reason for concern. But that was last year where everybody was just like dead set. Tim Kelly's the best possible hire for offensive coordinator. Go get him. Just get this Downing thing over with now. Bring Tim Kelly in. That was 2022 offseason. That's what everybody wanted in the 2022 offseason. Now, it wasn't as strong for Drake London, but there were a lot of people who thought he showed signs of promise in Atlanta, that the fact that he'd worked with Arthur Smith, who had previously been our successful offense coordinator here, had a lot of things going for him. There was, he wasn't anybody. I don't think anybody maybe was picking him as the favorite, the number one candidate to be the offense coordinator. There's definitely some momentum, some people that were talking, saying good things about him, liking the idea of potentially him being the offense coordinator. But, as I mentioned, we promoted Tim Kelly, still brought Drake London in to be passing game coordinator. I don't know what to make of that, because I honestly, a lot of people are really negative on it, but I think it's just because they did not want us to promote from within again, because that's been the cycle for every offensive coordinator hire under Vrabel. Started with Matt LaFleur, promoted Arthur Smith when he left, promoted Todd Downing when he left. I think they felt, everybody just kind of generally was like, wanted something different, wanted to shake things up more, and promoting from within, particularly coming off of how bad things were, just left a bad taste in a lot of people's mouth. But to me, it's like, I don't know why the people who are smarter than me, like a lot of like really good podcasters and media people here, who last year were just thought Tim Kelly was the second coming of, who's the guy who made the West Coast offense? My brain always stops on these live streams. Bill Walsh. You would have thought he was the second coming of Bill Walsh last season when people were desperate for him to take over as offensive coordinator last year. A year later, I don't know why people have soured on him so much, other than the fact that they wanted us to go get somebody from the outside, because we ultimately don't know what his contributions to the offense were. We don't know how involved he was in the failures of, I do kind of think it doesn't make a lot of sense to, when you have something that completely fails to the point that you have to fire somebody, to then turn to their like second in command and be like, okay, you take it over. To me, with the offensive line coach, I'm more concerned with that, because if you look at that guy's background, he has not a really impressive resume, but I mean, everybody's got to start somewhere, I guess. But when Kevin Strong was failing to get anything out of the offensive line, to build any players up, to develop any young players for the offensive line, was his assistant just standing off to the side going like, I wouldn't do that, but I guess if that's what you want to do, go ahead and do it, Kevin. Why is he, if he was already here, why was he not able to contribute more and make things better? Shouldn't that have been his job, to help elevate Kevin Strong instead of sitting there and watching Kevin Strong fail? Don't know. Obviously don't know the inner workings of the team, how these positions actually work, how these people who are inheriting these positions, what their role was previously. All I know is I don't want to be negative on Tim Kelly, because I was convinced last year by a lot of people that he was going to be the savior for our offense. I don't know why we've changed that after a year when we don't really know what he was doing, what his involvement in the team was. I can't, well, the proof's going to be in the pudding. Vrabel, I mean, really, he's got, I'd say, two things wrong. Kevin Strong, Todd Downing, his track record with building coaching staffs have been pretty solid otherwise. A lot of people were saying, well, if we were going to do this, if we were going to hire Tim Kelly, number one, why didn't they make the change in season and give it to him then? I think there's probably two reasons. One, it's probably just very difficult. There's so much that goes into building an NFL offense. It probably would have been difficult under any circumstances to just make that change midseason. Like, often when you see that happen, you don't often see an offensive coordinator get fired or demoted in season and another person kind of takes over. Usually if like an offensive coordinator gets fired or demoted, it's the head coach that's going to take over play calling and stuff like that. And that's not something Vrabel's going to do. Vrabel's not going to take over offensive play calling. So I don't think it would have been fair to Tim Kelly to actually ask him to completely change the offense mid-season. So I think that's one reason. But I think the other reason was there's a good chance, and somebody tweeted this out, I can't take full credit for this idea, but there's a chance that somewhere along the way this season, Vrabel knew there was a chance that whether he liked it or not, he was probably going to have to fire Todd Downing in the offseason. And if he thought Tim Kelly was who he was going to replace Todd Downing with if he had to fire him, and he knew how bad our offense was and how there was probably nothing any coach could do to save it, why would he throw Tim Kelly into that mess and potentially put a stink on Tim Kelly that would have made it even more negative if he hired Tim Kelly to be the offensive coordinator? So I think there was a degree of protecting Tim Kelly with not making a change in season in twofolds. One, it would have been asking too much to completely have him come in and try to fix the offense. And two, if he takes it over midseason and then we still lose the last 7 games of the season, everybody's going to be really negative on him, and Vrabel's going to have a hard time getting him hired if that was his guy, if that was what he wanted to do. So my kind of thoughts there on that. I don't know. Everybody was like super high on Tim Kelly last year, so I'm not going to be one of the people who just suddenly says like, oh, this sucks. Would I have liked us to go out and get somebody else, try to change it up? Probably, just for the sake of trying something new. The old saying that I guess is not a true saying is the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. But we'll see. I mean, I'm not going to turn on Tim Kelly after this last year, after everybody was like so desperate for him to be the offensive coordinator. I'll give him a shot. We'll see what happens. Because I think the one other issue, kind of weird part about him getting the hire was, why did it take so long? Like, we fired Todd Downing pretty much right after the season ended, and now we're like over a month later it took to hire Tim Kelly, who was already there, and you already knew who he was and what he was bringing to the table. I do think there's a possibility that there was another candidate out there. Once again, I talked about the timing of, coincidental timing of J-Rob getting fired right after the A.J. Brown game. Eric Bieniemy, the offensive coordinator for the Chiefs, who was, apparently he never interviewed with the Titans, but there's certainly a lot of rumblings that there was interest there and he could be a potential candidate. I believe at one of the Super Bowl media events, he said he had not interviewed for any outside offensive coordinator positions with any other teams, was only focused on potential head coaching opportunities, and that the only interview he'd taken so far was an interview with the Colts for their head coaching position. The day after that is when Tim Kelly got announced as being promoted to offensive coordinator. So I don't know if there was feelers being sent back and forth between the Titans and Bieniemy, or if they were hoping to maybe talk to him or something like that. And then when he came out and said, I'm only focused on potential head coaching opportunities, I plan to continue on as the offensive coordinator for the Chiefs. If there's not anything like that, if they kind of got the memo, hey, he's not moving, and they went, all right, let's pull the trigger on Kelly then. I don't know. It was a little weird timing for me, and I don't really know what explanation there was for waiting so long to promote Tim Kelly when he was just already there. So, I don't know. The thing that's interesting, and I've heard some people say this, it's kind of been a quiet rumble, but it hasn't really taken over yet, is a lot of people were starting to say things toward the end of the season when they were criticizing Downing's play selection, particularly the high number of first down runs, there were a lot of people who were starting to kind of say, well, he's not calling 21 first down runs out of 28 first downs in a game if that's not the directive he's been given by the head coach. If Mike Vrabel didn't want him to call 21 out of 28 first downs as a run play, even though he's a defensive coach, he's not in charge of the offense, he doesn't run the offense. That's the head coach's job to kind of dictate to his coordinators how he wants the systems to work. So there's a degree to which whatever Todd Downing was doing, the lack of creativity is probably in it for the biggest issue to me, but the overall scheme, the overall ideas of the offense, to a degree, would have come from Vrabel. So that's something to kind of keep in mind, particularly where we're, once again, promoting from within, keeping kind of things the same. And I think with this flip, with the flip of the general manager, with the flip of all these coaches, Vrabel's had a really good spot. He's got a lot of goodwill, but it doesn't last forever. Jeff Fisher was king of Nashville, and by the end, I think most people thought it was the right decision for him to move on. And if Vrabel didn't get these coaches switched right, if the Ran Carthon thing doesn't work, the next time, once the head coach fires his coordinators, the next thing is, falling on your own sword. So I don't think we'll get to there. I have a lot of faith in Vrabel as a coach. I trust him, so I think I'm pretty satisfied with most of the decisions he's made this offseason. The offensive line coach is the weirdest one to me. But, it's the proof will be in the pudding. We'll see what'll happen there. But, yeah, the last thing I wanted to kind of talk about was, we're not going to really know, like I mentioned with Ran Carthon, really what his strategy is going to be, what his roster build is going to look like until we get into the free agency opening in March and then the draft in April. But there's been pretty much nonstop talk about what the roster is going to look like next year. And when the season ended, I was like, one of the things that was most intriguing about the Titans offseason to me is it's the most wide open offseason we've ever had. Of the players on our team, you never turn over that much of your team, but I think in my mind, there's only, toward the end of the season in my mind, I had 3 players that I was 100% guaranteed those 3 players will definitely be on the roster next season. Beyond that, I could not, say for sure or guarantee that any other players would be. And those 3 players at the end of the season were Nicholas Petit-Frere, Treylon Burks, and Ryan Stonehouse. As I've gotten more in the offseason, I've not 100% been sold on Nicholas Petit-Frere. I could, if he comes into training camp and hasn't really looked like he's improved much, and they've make a big effort to restock the offensive line, he could find himself on the chopping block. He could, potentially even, based on the little bit of talent he showed, he could be a trade candidate to, somebody for a 5th, 6th round pick, something like that. So I'm not even sold on him. But Ryan Stonehouse, I would say 100% will be on the team next year. Treylon Burks, I'd be 99.9%. Because even that, I never would have thought we were going to trade A.J. Brown last offseason. We did that, so who knows. But beyond those 2, I can see everybody else going. If they feel they can't get the contract done with Jeff Simmons, same as A.J. Brown, they might trade him. If they feel it's time to move on from Kevin Byard, get that cap number off the books, they could cut him. Tannehill obviously has been one of the biggest pieces of discussion about quarterback. What's going to happen with the quarterback position? And Tim Kelly getting the promotion, Tim Kelly keeping in Vrabel's comments about that, where he said he doesn't think everything's completely broken. He doesn't seem to see the need to completely just throw everything out and start from scratch, would kind of lead you to believe that maybe there will be a little bit more consistency in the turnover of the roster from this year to next year than what I maybe originally thought at the end of the season. Which would make me believe that there's a very good chance Ryan Tannehill will still be the quarterback next year. I would, if I was a betting man, which I am, if you could place a bet on who the Titans starting quarterback for the 2023 season was going to be, I would bet on Ryan Tannehill. But it's going to be interesting because there's been rumblings from not really reliable sources, but that we reached out to the Bears about potentially trading for the number 1 overall pick. I don't know that we've actually reached out and offered anything, but I would be shocked if, every team that's anywhere close to being in the mix for potentially being able to move up doesn't at least touch base with the Bears to see what the asking price is. But that, I don't know that that's something Ran Carthon's going to pull the trigger on right out of the gates. His first move, just come in guns blazing like that. I don't know that he's going to do that. Um, but if certain things happen and one of those, the three or whatever, four top-rated quarterbacks fall to 11, do we take a quarterback there and let them sit behind Tannehill for a year? That would make sense to me more than anything. But yeah, I don't see Tannehill going anywhere. I think he's still going to be the quarterback. There's every time any quarterbacks potentially looking to leave their team, people start thinking, well, could they come to the Titans? Aaron Rodgers, Derek Carr, Lamar Jackson, some of the ones that have been kind of bandied about. Brady before he announced his retirement, and some people were like, well, maybe now's the time when Brady comes to Tennessee. And I can't see any of those quarterbacks wanting to come here. And I hope, as much as I would love to have like Lamar Jackson as a Tennessee Titans quarterback, there's no way he would want to come to this situation. There's no way this situation could work with him, because the draft capital you would have to give up to get him, the salary cap space you would have to give up to give him the huge, massive contract he wants, would just cripple any chance we have of fixing the holes, fixing the issues we have in this roster right now. We need too much repair work done to the roster through free agency, through the draft, to give up draft capital and a huge chunk of the salary cap to a veteran quarterback. Like I said, love to have Lamar Jackson. Really probably wouldn't want, as much Aaron Rodgers or Brady at this point, but it just doesn't make sense for where the Titans are at as a franchise. I'm normally a person who's like, I don't think the draft picks have as much value as NFL general managers seem to think they have. It's crazy, like the NBA, like there's like, what, the trade deadline just passed there, and teams are trading players, and then they're like, oh, hey, you want a first round pick with that trade too? And they're like, no, we're good with what we got so far. They're like, we'll throw that first round pick in just for goodwill. Like, they just throw first round draft picks out like they're candy. Like, there was like one trade today that I think had like 4 first round draft picks attached to it. NFL teams are like desperate to never ever give up draft picks, which to me is like, if you know the player, or you believe the player is the key last little component you need to make your team successful, I'd much rather trade a first round draft pick for an established player that I believed was already going to be successful than drafting a rookie, because rookies, it's a crapshoot. Look at the Titans' recent drafts. You just really don't know what you're going to get with your drafts. Even high level top tier players that can't miss players miss sometimes. So, but that's not where the Titans are. The Titans aren't one player away. I kind of would equate it to like the Broncos. You look at the Broncos. They were a quarterback away from probably being a really, 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 really good football team. Had a really good defense, solid receiving core, solid just overall around the team. Thought, let's go get Russell Wilson. We get the key talented quarterback in. It'll fix everything. And unfortunately for them, that was the right move in a sense. But the fact that Russell Wilson is just not a good quarterback anymore ended up undoing the whole thing. And the fact that Nathaniel Hackett might be the worst person to ever get a head coaching job in NFL history. I was blown away by how bad he was. Because I listened to an interview with him before the season. He sounded like a really smart guy. He sounded like a really, knew what he's talking about. But they were just such a disaster, just so unorganized. But once again, that's not where the Titans are. The Titans aren't one player away from being like a major top contender. They need a lot of work on the roster, so they need all the draft picks they can get. They need all the cap space they can get to go out and patch some holes in free agency. And so bringing in a veteran high-priced quarterback just wouldn't work. And if the Ravens are going to trade Lamar Jackson, I don't see the Titans being a situation he would be interested in coming into right now. Aaron Rodgers, his big gripe seems to be that they don't give him any help up in Green Bay. There's not enough talent on the offense. And look at the Titans' offense. Is that going to be something that's going to be like, oh man, let me trade this crappy offense I've got in Green Bay for that crappy offense in Tennessee? Don't think so. The one kind of out there quarterback that would be interesting to me potentially trading for, and it had to be the price right. And I don't even know what the price could possibly be for this guy, because he's such an unknown at this point, would be Trey Lance. So the 49ers at this point have come out and say Brock Purdy's earned their starting job. Trey Lance, who they drafted, I think, 5th overall 2 years ago, got outplayed for it. But he didn't get outplayed for it. He got injured. He's been out the entire season. He was, barely played at all last year. So I don't know what they would want to get in return for him, because he hasn't proven that he's worth a first round draft pick. But at the same time, he's on a rookie contract. He's not tying up a lot of cap space for him. They don't have a lot of motivation to trade him unless they get an offer they can't refuse. So I wouldn't give up a whole lot to get him. But if they were just trying to, clear up the quarterback room, avoid any potential controversy, and just get him out of there, and we're willing to take like a second or third round pick for him, I would be, at least intrigued by that if I was the Titans to at least sniff around on that because, something about him made the 49ers, of whom Ran Carthon was in the personnel department at the time, feel the need to make some significant trades, make some moves to get up to the fifth overall pick to draft him when they already had Jimmy Garoppolo, who had taken them to a Super Bowl. So he had something that made that organization feel like it was worth moving around, making a big trade up to get him. Ran Carthon was a part of that at that time. He's a part of the Titans now. Is there a connection there? Once again, I don't know. Like I said, I don't think the 49ers, unless they're just trying to get him out to make sure there's no quarterback controversy, they don't really have a motivation to trade him unless they got a significant offer for him. And I wouldn't necessarily make a significant offer for him just because he's so unproven at this point in time. And once again, with all the Titans' needs, I wouldn't want to give up draft capital unless it was pretty close to a sure thing we were getting. But he's interesting. It's interesting. It's the one name that I've seen floated around of potential quarterbacks we could possibly trade for that I thought was a combination of interesting and realistic. But like I said, my best guess is we stick with Tannehill for one more season. I don't want to say that we could potentially tank this season to put ourselves in a better position for a top quarterback next year's draft, but it's going to be very interesting to see how hard they go out and how aggressive the Titans are in building a better roster for next season. Because it's hard to see Tannehill being the quarterback beyond next season. Like 2025, I don't see any scenario where Tannehill's the quarterback then. So if you know that now is the time to start thinking, what's the future? I don't know. It's going to be an interesting offseason, though. We'll definitely be back with a lot more updates. As we get into free agency, once some things start happening, we might do some news updates on those. As we get closer to the draft, we'll talk about the draft. I'll get my buddy Kyle in. He's my draft expert. He does mock drafts, and it's been hilarious for like 3 straight years. He's written out mock drafts, and like the Carolina Panthers have almost copied his draft exactly. It's been insane, some of the stuff like where he's been like, I think this guy would be a perfect for the Titans. Panthers draft that guy. We'll get him on the channel somewhere around the time of the draft and do that stuff. But this kind of wraps up 2022 for the Titans here on the channel. We'll be looking forward to the future and hopefully better times for 2023 on future Titans videos. So make sure you're subscribed with the bell turned on for notifications. So anytime there's a game day vlog, you get notified when it's posted. Anytime I go live to do one of these chats, you'll get notified that I'm live. So thanks for watching. We will see you soon. This is going to be the saddest Titan up ever, but 2022, put a bow on it. It's done. Tighten up.